Welcome to tonight's talk by Jack Tchen and our year-long series on memorials and commemoration in the U.S. Tonight's program will start with a short video about the humanities at URI.
We are facing problems and challenges that do not have easy, simple, finite solutions. Machines are going to be doing so much stuff for us. The only things that are going to be left are the things that only human brains can do. And those kinds of things are taught by arts and humanities.
Studying the humanities, studying literature, drama, art, performance, what that feeds in a student is possibility.
The University of Rhode Island is a really good place to pursue one's interests in an environment of opportunities. That engagement, in some way, shape, or form, becomes in part the definition of the university experience.
Every area of the humanities trains you to investigate, explore. If you want to lead, you have to have a broad, interdisciplinary, open-minded approach to the world.
Exploration is the foundation of everything that we do. You have to be able to think beyond the circumstances you're presently in. The critical thinking, the language skills, reasoning abilities, those are the ways that you can build a bridge between what you did before and what you can do in the future.
The skills students learn in the humanities are skills that they will take into every aspect of their future life, both personal and professional.
The problems that we have facing us are complicated issues that require people who move across disciplines, think creatively, think deeply. That's something that humanities provides. You're getting that methodology and the practice that'll prepare you for your future.
Good evening. I'm Eve Stern, Director of URI Center for the Humanities. I'd like to welcome you to the third event in our series on memorials and commemoration in the U.S. This year-long series of virtual and in-person events will discuss our collective decisions and dialogues about whom to commemorate, the ideals we express, and whom to include. This evening, the Center is delighted to present Professor Jack Tchen, who will be speaking about Before 1776, Time to Break the Silence. We will have questions and answers after the panel, so please type your questions into the chat at any time and be sure to like and share this talk on social media. Now I'd like to welcome Dr. Christine Mock, Professor of English at URI, to introduce our speaker.
Thank you, Dr. Stern. Jack Tchen is a historian, curator, writer, and dumpster diver devoted to anti-racist, anti-colonialist, democratic participatory storytelling, scholarship, and opening up archives, museums, organizations, and classroom spaces to the stories and realities of those excluded and deemed quote-unquote unfit in master narratives. Professor Tchen has been honored to be the inaugural Clement A. Price Professor of Public History and Humanities at Rutgers University, Newark, and Director of the Clement Price Institute on Ethnicity, Culture, and the Modern Experience since fall 2018. Professor Tchen's extensive career as a public humanities scholar includes serving as the senior historian for a New York Historical Society exhibition on the impact of Chinese exclusion laws on the formation of the U.S., and as senior advisor for the 2-Hour American Experience PBS documentary on the Chinese Exclusion Act. His most recent book, Yellow Peril, An Archive of Anti-Asian Fear, 2014, is a critical archival study of images, excerpts, and essays on the history and contemporary impact of paranoia and xenophobia. In 1996, he founded the APA, Asian Pacific American Studies Program and Institute and Research Collections at New York University, where he worked closely with Jack G. Shaheen and brought in his research collection on anti-Arab representations in television and Hollywood. In 1980, he co-founded the Museum of Chinese in America. Most recently, Professor Tchen is engaged with global warming crisis, eco-justice, and the deep history of the region, founding New York New Work Public History Project of the Public History Project, funded by the Ford Foundation. Please welcome Dr. Tchen.
Thank you very much, Professor Mock and Professor Stern. And also, I just want to acknowledge Leah Cooper, who's the DJ behind the scenes, making everything work. I thought it'd be helpful to kind of explain this title, Before 1776, A Time to Break the Silence. Now, some of you may remember that quote, A Time to Break the Silence. It's Dr. Martin Luther King's speech, his Beyond Vietnam speech that he gave at Riverside Church in 1967, and that was kind of a key phrase that he had played out. And this was a time, 50 more years ago, in which he realized that the fight for civil rights, the fight for the war on poverty, was not possible unless the United States also grappled with the systemic nature of how racism worked and how hypermaterialism worked, and also how the Vietnam War had to be stopped. This was a major break in which most people believe led to his assassination. I'll just cite him in that quote. Increasingly, by choice or by accident, this is the role our nation has taken, the role of those who make peaceful revolution impossible by refusing to give up the privileges and the pleasures that come from the immense profits of overseas investment. I'm convinced that if we are to get on the right side of the world revolution, we as a nation must undergo a radical revolution of values. We must rapidly begin the shift from a thing-oriented society to a person-oriented society, when machines and computers, profit motives, and property rights are considered more important than people. The giant triplets of racism, materialism, and militarism are incapable of being conquered. So just 50 years ago, so computers were just emerging on the scene, and now we're in this digital world and this digital age during a pandemic. So he goes from rights projects to justice projects. So I think what we'd like to kind of talk about today is really how this moment of the pandemic moment that Arundhati Roy calls the pandemic moment is one in which we now, 50 years later, understand that there's never been a greater concentration of wealth in the nation nor in the world, in which the reference to millionaires is now billionaires. And the acceleration of the worsening of our environment is happening related to the global pandemic. So in many ways, we are now facing not only the giant triplets that Dr. King referred to, but we're also facing T-minus 6 years to mitigate the carbon footprint, to come up with some dramatic, radical solutions, but also dramatic, radical organizing to start reducing the already worsening and cascading impacts of global warming and global diseases spreading. So in many ways, our challenges now with these giant triplets being unaddressed have worsened and really have gotten us into a more dramatic situation that Dr. King probably could never have imagined. But of course, we need the kind of leadership that he gave at that moment, as well as the leadership of Malcolm X, and they, in many ways, bring us to what I want to talk about. And I'll just reiterate, unbeknownst to us living and struggling today, the foundational dynamics of settler colonialism has formed the conditions which all subsequent migrants who came in after Indigenous people were enslaved in the Northeast, after Indigenous people who were both African and also Native American, North American, Native American, in which what they experienced provide the foundation in which all migrants and immigrants subsequently began to shape their lives around. I'll touch upon the processes of dispossession, enslavement, and empire building that has fragmented our sense of place and belonging and separated out being part of the larger living world in which we don't have a sense of our ecosystems and the regions in which we live in. So today, with the cascading impacts of global warming, we need to reckon with these realities. This memory work of that deep past is now more urgent than ever. We all need to reweave the present with this past and to work towards a pluriversal, not universal, survival plan. So when Professor Stern first wrote me, she was hoping that I would talk about Asian Americans, China, the China trade, memorials, which I've been involved in terms of the New York City Mayor's Committee on Public Art, Monuments, and Memorials. And in many ways, that's defined a lot of my work over the past decades. And part of what I did is I looked at the deep roots in which the perception of the Oriental, quote unquote, other was formulated in the United States. And it goes back, quite frankly, to something that's really at the heart of Rhode Island's identity and how Rhode Island wealthy people and powerful people first came to make their money. That has to do with the China trade, which was, of course, key to the development of New England, but also down to New York and Baltimore. So there are deep ties of the China trade to Providence, especially, that proliferated and kind of expanded across the state. Now, part of what we're talking about in terms of the China trade is really how Alexander Hamilton talked about it as the key to the wealth building of the nation. And he talked about it in terms of the British concept of political arithmetic. Now, we can go into more of that, but I'm not going to go into great detail. But basically, it was about trade. And how do you trade things to begin to objectify human bodies in terms of slave trade? How do you begin to price and cost out parts of nature that become part of the extractivist economy? A tree, for example, a beaver pelt being kind of made out of a living beaver. How do you then exploit this incredible new land that the indigenous people who had been stewarding this land for thousands of years, how do you begin to commodify that to build the wealth of this new nation? Now, we did not learn, I certainly did not learn, perhaps you have, about the Pope's decree in 1493 of the doctrine of discovery, in which he was saying that all of the Christian nations that went out and planted their flag of their aristocratic sponsor could claim that land. All non-Christian lands could be claimed. And of course, we know the history of Spanish and Portuguese splitting up the world. And this was done in the name of, in the name of the king and queen, but really it was also in the obsessive pursuit of gold and silver. We know that the Dutch ships also went all around the world in their love of things from various places of the world being brought back to build up the quote unquote golden age of Amsterdam. And we also know, of course, about the British Empire building its massive empire that really brings us into the formation with the Dutch of New England and the Northeast of the United States, what would become the United States. Now, for me, I was looking at really how the British and Dutch China trade really prefigured the emergence of Chinese in the Americas. Um, Chinese in the Americas also began to arrive with the Spanish galleon trades in the galleon ships that was trading from Manila to Acapulco in the mid 1500s. And it's really through these trade relationships in which all notions of the Chinese and Asian other, what we would call Orientalism, the Oriental other, began to form in the Western imagination. So it was really the British, in particular, exploitation of tea, teacups, porcelains, and then opium that dramatically changed the balance of world trade and enabled the British Empire to really grow and proliferate. And at the root of this was also a kind of Calvinist Protestant set of values, a political culture in which it began to privilege certain humans over other humans, began to formulate the kind of hierarchy of the races of mankind, but also began to privilege humans above nature itself, and how to turn nature into basically one massive market in which it could be traded for the benefit of the growing empire. So what does all this have to do with monuments and memorials? And this question of who that invisible self that was really making decisions about what memorials would be commemorated and what monuments would be built. So in many ways, I'll just kind of bring you up to how I was a member of the New York City Mayor's Commission on Public Art, Historical Markers, and Monuments. And the four that the mayor immediately kind of on his own said that we should look at was the Columbus statue at Columbus Circle, the Teddy Roosevelt statue in front of the American Museum of Natural History, where he's seated on a noble steed, and he's flanked by an African in a loincloth who's holding a rifle, a gun carrier for Teddy Roosevelt, and to his right is a Plains Indian with a headdress also holding a rifle, the other rifle holder, the other gun holder, in Teddy Roosevelt's great hunt into Africa and elsewhere. The other monument that the mayor talked about was getting rid of, perhaps, Marion T. Sims statue. He was the father of U.S. gynecology. This was located on the east side of Central Park. And Marion Sims, besides being kind of the pioneer for Western women of practices of how to give better birth, experimented on enslaved women without anesthesia. So this is a person and a monument that's been protested for many years because it happens to be in the basically Spanish Harlem, and also people in Harlem and Spanish Harlem have been organizing in protest of that monument. The fourth, I'll just quickly mention, is General Pétain, who was a World War I hero. And then with Nazi expansionism, he became the president of Vichy France. Now, I was expected to be the ethnic representative for Asian Americans in the way city politics plays out. But a few of us on the panel were also talking about how we can't really decide about which monuments should stay or what monuments need to be added, because there's basically a chaos of different kinds of monuments and markers and public art that didn't add up. They weren't about the history. And we had to ground each of those monuments, if we're going to make a decision, in what the history of dispossession and enslavement had been in the region. And unless we did that, how could we make a decision about Teddy Roosevelt based on how beautifully the horse was done, based on how it didn't appear from the eyes of certain people that this was not a set of racist stereotypes? It was really an enlightening experience for me. And in many ways, I wanted to reflect more deeply on my own experience in terms of my own journey of deciding to leave NYU after being there for 22 years and going to Rutgers at Newark in the present job that I have now. And I realized that in the midst of New York City, which was in a massive place of denial, in which the university itself is in this period of massive growth and depending more and more on the real estate interests of the Board of Trustees, that I needed to go to a public university in which there would be much more freedom to really pursue and create a university for the future. And in many ways, I think the University of Rhode Island is also part of that future, from what I can tell and what I can see. And that it's a place then that would allow me to begin to look at the deep history that's below the surface, below the grid, below and underneath the patina of what appears to be so sparkly, and to deal with what actually happened in the region. And what we've been doing through the Public History Project is actually looking at how settler colonialism actually worked and how the dispossession of the Munsee Lenape people in particular, north of the Ramapo River, were increasingly moved, were attacked, were basically massacred, and then put into positions in which they would deed the land that was being aggressively occupied by both the Dutch and the British Puritans. And that in that exchange of these parcels of land, there is also the enslavement process. So there'd be 500,000 acres that would be transferred from supposedly from the legal representatives of the Munsee peoples to a corrupt crony of the various governors of the Dutch and the British. And to work those lands then would be enslaved people would be brought in to work those lands. And that extractivism became a key way in which the forests were clear-cut and the creatures on the land were basically exploited for their furs and basically wiped out. The fish would be overfished. So we go from the moment in which we have whales breaching the Hudson River. Yes, breaching the Hudson River, and all the migrating fish and all the millions and billions of oysters and the incredible diversity of the ecosystem was just very quickly, over a short period of time, relatively speaking, basically turned into a barren landscape in which a growing city would be built upon. So how can we understand settler colonialism and its impacts, not as the beginning of the story of the city and the region that we now talk about as the New York metropolitan region, but how can we understand the deep history that's underneath that, the pre-colonial history in which the indigenous people created a whole world of pathways, of ceremonial stone landscapes, and a whole way of understanding and expressing their intimacy with nature. This was one of the most biodiverse parts of the world that quickly became despoiled. And if you look at the early testimonies of those folks, you begin to see what had actually happened. And what we can do now is begin to kind of excavate bits and pieces of those stories to begin to appreciate what was really here. We tend to want to see a National Geographic film to understand, oh, isn't that part of Alaska beautiful? Isn't that Amazon amazing? And shouldn't we be protesting how it's being mowed down at such an alarming rate every day? But in fact, the region that we live in, certainly New England and certainly the Mid-Atlantic, were equally important in terms of biodiversity. And basically, we have not come to terms with how we've essentially dramatically despoiled that biodiversity. Now, it's very hard for people who have benefited from colonialism or within power to actually come to terms with their own past. But it's actually essential, from my point of view, to come to terms with that, because unless we do, we actually don't know how to deal with global warming. Because we tend to think of our present as somehow all-encompassing and that somehow the problems have to do with forces outside and beyond our control. But here we have to return to Dr. King's challenge of 50 years ago, in which the giant triplets have been disabling not only the wealth of the nation and the equity of the nation in terms of the war on poverty, but it's now actually affecting the very democratic basis of the United States, in which hypermaterialism has run amok, in which the permanent war machine can be tripped with basically a claim that there are weapons of mass destruction that are out to get us. And then that launches one of the longest wars of United States' history. And racism, both against this purported enemy, but also racism that's accelerated within the United States over the past 50 years, has also become more vicious and brutal the more it's been exposed, and the more, in some ways, white supremacy is actually pushing back, to the point that the Republican Party now actually is so dominant in terms of the notions and holding on to ideas of white supremacy. How can we understand our future depends on our understanding beyond these private little lots that we live in, and define our sense of well-being and define our sense of wealth, in which we're not able to see and understand the relationship of our little part of that local area in relationship to the ecosystem and the living reality outside of that little lot. So we don't understand really the living nature of the region itself, and how we are connected in what we do every day, in our consumption every day, to that larger region. How can we do something in the everyday and the here and now, which begins to change and expresses our understanding of the larger region and our relationships to the larger region? So I'll just talk briefly about how the work I'm doing at Rutgers at Newark, the Price Institute, is beginning to try to grapple with that. And here I'd like to invite the faculty and students and administrators at your university to begin to think about how we might be able to work together, because we're in a desperate situation. As we all know, the IPCC report says that we have about 6 years left before the cascading and devastating impacts that we're already seeing happen, not only in North America, but across the world, begin to accelerate and begin to move past the tipping point in which much can be done. How can we understand really what we can do on our campuses that explore the deep history, that try to unlock how beyond the private lots that we live in and grow up in can be understood in a larger way, in which we can then begin to unpack the political arithmetic and the ways in which our local regions with their rich ecosystems have been basically dismantled over a very short amount of time. And how can we learn from indigenous local knowledges that are actually still there and surrounding us, of the people, of the indigenous people who are still in the very places that we're living? How can we begin to tap their knowledge and their understanding of the larger region in a way that actually can begin to make the dramatic changes that we have to make to be able to effectively deal with the global warming and the T-6 years that we're left with? So what I'm suggesting is that we have to be able to launch many local justice projects that are deeply engaging the campus and the community. These classes have to move beyond the individual 3-credit or 4-credit course and begin to interconnect with other courses across the campus and other disciplines across the campus and other divisions across the campus, in which you can actually think about problem solving as the core goal, as opposed to getting the credits that you need to graduate. How can we begin to reimagine education in a way that can begin to collaborate with our families, our communities, and building networks of networks in which collaborative, meaning-making, research, and challenges can be made to the narrow, limited ways in which we think that the progress of the future is made. It's, of course, beyond the point in which we can only think about our individual careers, but how can we think about our individual futures within the context of a joint, shared, collaborative process? So part of how we're doing this at Rutgers at Newark is that we're thinking about how oral histories, storytelling, mapping, the region, the importance of place, how we can work with Indigenous peoples in developing and cultivating local Indigenous knowledge, in which land is not simply a metaphor, but land is also understood as an ecosystem in which sustainable food, land as a system in which the soil and the health of the soil, water in which the living nature of the water itself has to be paid attention to. The Passaic River that our campus and our city is on was actually basically an industrial dump and wasteland. And how can that air be also something that we all begin to care about and understand beyond our individual ability to breathe something healthy? So that this question of how can Indigenous African and Afro-Caribbean knowledges and how Indigenous North American, Native American knowledges are essential to our reckoning with this disavowed past is at the core, I think, of the challenge and the core resources that they bring and their memory and their history brings to how we can move beyond this very limited moment. Now, reckoning with an unresolved past is actually quite difficult. And in many ways, I think in our films, in the horror films that we see, and in so much of the popular culture that this country has built around itself is full of hauntings, is full of horror. And it's really a series of unresolved ways in which the past and the injustice of the past continue to live and haunt our present. So the question becomes, how can we acknowledge what's happened and begin to live with that past in a way that is actually reckoning with these hauntings, reckoning with the injustice that's happened, and begin to make changes? So the question of monuments and memorials is maybe something that doesn't quite get at that. How much money does it take to make a memorial happen? How much money does it take to build a monument? Instead, perhaps we can learn from Indigenous practices in which the more we focus on the place and the restoration of a place, the more that becomes a living memorial to the collective well-being that we all need to be building together. I can give examples of things that we've done. One of them, for example, is how storytelling becomes kind of essential to understand how a place has changed over time. So there's one photograph of Passaic, New Jersey, which is an industrial town that had many factories, but it also quickly became a post-industrial town, and that it was along the Passaic River itself. And we're showing one of these images at a recent program that we had. And what we did is we showed the outline of where the factory had been, and also the outline of where Indigenous burial ground was that nobody had not acknowledged, although just with a little bit of research, you could actually find out that this is actually sacred land. And then what we began to suggest in this photograph is that there's a layering of the present that people could still recognize and the deeper past that had been basically forgotten. And one of our beloved faculty members kind of saw that photograph and was shocked by it, because what she said is that she comes from a Holocaust family. She's now about ready to retire, and her father came out of the Holocaust as a Holocaust survivor and ended up working and making his money to support the family at one of the factories that was no longer located in that photograph, but had been there. And she had no idea that as a Holocaust survivor, which still haunted her, that this is also the sacred ground of a Indigenous Muncie Lenape burial site that nobody knew about. So in some ways, you begin to see how the stories of immigrants, which begin to dominate the landscape, is done in a way in which it doesn't understand the foundational basis of how that region was formed, based on the enslavement of peoples and based on the actual dispossession of Indigenous peoples from that land itself. So I think through our daily activities, through our research that we can do in the classroom, and the research that we can share with our families and the communities that we're a part of, we can begin to actually to dramatically change the storytelling and the understanding of how we frame in a larger and larger way, beyond those individual lots, what the region is about and what the stories are about. At the same time that we're showing that photograph, one of my students who lives in Passaic today, he's Latinx and kind of brings his immigrant experience with him, began to say, well, I live there too. And what we're hoping is that he's going to be able to tell that story to his younger siblings, and that the memory and impact of this kind of storytelling, not academic work, not academic essays, which are important, but the storytelling that can be conveyed in an effective and visceral way can be communicated so that these stories can span generations of the past, of people you know, of your parents, of your grandparents, but also your younger siblings, children of your children, and their children. So in many ways, the possibilities of being able to enlarge our imagination really is in each of our hands. And collectively, I think we can begin to realize what the Haudenosaunee have talked about in terms of thinking of 7 generations and making decisions based on 7 generations. Now, many people interpret that as, well, 7 generations ahead and trying to make decisions that can be beneficial for them. But that itself is a bit abstract, because how are we going to know that person in 7 generations from now, and why should we care about them? But in fact, another interpretation of what that means is that it's knowing of where we come from 3 generations past, in which some of us actually know people or ourselves are a part of that 3 or 4 generations, in which our great-grandparents, for example, somebody knew them, and the grandparents can tell stories about who they were and what they cared about. So we actually have a living relationship to those generations. And the same can be said of the 3 generations following us as well. So in many ways, I think the key for our ability to think in many different periods of time, but also compare the local place that we're living in, whether it's the Passaic street corner where that factory had been and where one walked to school every day and had the memories of one's father working in that factory over there, can be expanded in a way in which the past, the deep past, is understood. And that, to me, I think is also our hope for how we can begin to understand what the deep future is as well. So it becomes a question, I'm just going to wrap up here, how can we work together? How can we work together across time and begin to unlock those layers that still haunt our landscapes and are still oftentimes buried and unacknowledged? But also, how can we work together in a way in which the future of our work at the university itself, in which we're full of hope that it's going to bring us a good job and bring us some happy career of the future and bring us some money to pay the bills, how can that be turned into a way in which we can actually grapple with the growing dangers of climate change and global warming? So I'm really saying that that future is in our hands, and that unless we can actually take all these challenges seriously and move beyond our own individual careers and our own individual hopes for getting that house with a picket fence, and having our own plot of the future. If we can move beyond that, we can maybe include that, but we can't just limit our imaginations to that, or else the solutions that we can create together are not going to be made possible. So let me just end there, and I'm really happy to respond to any questions. I've kind of given you a broad sketch of what I'm thinking now about beyond the idea of monuments and memorials, which of course have lots of meaning and play a very important role in how we understand the past, how we imagine what the future should be. But in some ways, the challenge is, how can we make meaningful changes that actually will be, in some ways, much more important than the material monument itself? And how can we actually begin to create stories that actually will be told for generations to come about the challenges that we rose to? In many ways, I think a lot of us have parents or grandparents or families or neighbors who talk about the best years of their life in overcoming a certain period, a challenge, whether it be war or whether it be poverty. And I think now we're being challenged, even though it's kind of hard to imagine. How are we going to step up to deal with the challenges that are actually in our midst, both in terms of the global pandemic, but also in terms of the imminent threat of global warming, not just for us, but for the generations to come that we will know. So let me end there, and I'm really happy to take any questions that people have. Thank you very much.
Oh, Jack, thank you so much. There's so much there. And we've actually got some questions coming in. But since I sort of have your ear, I do sort of want to, I guess, ask you to expand a little bit about this. If like so this series is called Memorials and Commemoration in the United States. And you began us through MLK, and then in giving us this really great, deep overview of both your own career, but also like touching on Rhode Island, right? The way in which people and things, or things have been put ahead of people, right? And that we can think about this memorialization or the monuments, or this is once again this kind of push for the thing, rather that facilitates a certain kind of erasing of people. And the performance studies scholar in me is like super excited to hear that one of the methods that you offer up to us, that you at Rutgers are doing, is through oral history and storytelling. And so what I would like to sort of invite you to talk a little bit more about is how those methods how those methods rub up against something that is another thread that you've been speaking about, in particular as an Asian Americanist, but also that colleague of yours whose family who is descended from a family of Holocaust survivors, in which we have a kind of narrative implantment, I am an English professor, right, of immigrants into the logic of settler colonialism. And so I'd like you to talk a little bit more about like these methods of oral history and storytelling, and the way in which immigrants and refugees get like woven into the story of America in and through the logic of settler colonialism.
Yeah, that's a great question. It's a complicated question to answer, but it's something I think we can actually do in the classroom. And it's something that by taking our students seriously and the stories that they bring to the classroom with them, or to bring the stories they've maybe kind of heard, that in the same way that I kind of heard my mother constantly talking about the Opium Wars as if they were just 10 years ago, but they were in fact, over 150 years ago or 140 years ago. That kind of meaning making through storytelling and historical memory and personal anecdotes, how can those processes be woven in a larger and larger way the more that we gain exposure? Now, the difficulty here is that my parents were basically refugees, and they had no way of understanding what the history of where I grew up in the Midwest was about, which basically was a land grant area, and the land grants were created during the Morrill Act, in which large tracts of land were basically sold in speculation, oftentimes to land grant universities that could make their endowments or build their campuses based on those land giveaways, right? So that there's deeper layers of history that my immigrant family had no clue about. They didn't understand what that story was. But if they hear that story from credible sources, and there are many credible sources that engage our imagination, you can now go to a website and look at land grab universities and see what universities, in my case, Rutgers, how they were able to build their wealth through plots that were given to them as script in the Midwest, for example. Cornell University also massively built up its base from those land grant grabs. Now, by learning about that in the context of storytelling and in the context of what are the stories that are recognized within your family that are important to hear, by acknowledging all those layers of story, we need to then be putting them in relationship to each other, begin to understand what those time sequences are, but also especially stories about place, I think are very powerful. So for me, I just begin to see the possibilities of integrating, let's say, what's usually taught in writing and creative writing with what's done in history and local history, and how time and place become ways in which we can begin to kind of play out, really, the ways in which our courses and our framings, whether they be the sciences, social sciences, or humanities, or law or medicine, begin to be understood as really a joint problem solving and a joint meaning making set of exercises. I hope that's not too abstract, but maybe you could kind of also help me make that clear. But it seems to me that the plays that you produce are located in a time and place, and part of the challenge of the plays is to make that connection to the audience, and how do the actors become the vehicles in which they actually understand it to such a degree that they're able to make those connections and make that visceral understanding, not just a cognitive understanding, but a really heartfelt understanding conveyed to the audience as well.
That's fantastic. Thank you, Jack. This is actually one of the questions that's coming in. And please, if you have a question, please type it into the comments so that it can come up to me. And so here's the question. Can you comment on how popular understandings of Asian American history have changed since the founding of the Museum of Chinese in America, MoCA, in 1980?
Sure. I mean, it's now been around for a long time. I've not been directly always associated with it for that time, but I'll tell you a story from the very beginning, which is that when we were first formulating the idea of what a museum should do, it was in 1978, 1979. These are conversations I was having with the co-founder, Charlie Lai, who was, when I first met him, was still at Princeton University in a pre-med program. And then when we decided to actually work together, he quit that pre-med program and decided that this moment in which Chinatown was dramatically changing in the mid-70s, because finally the Chinese exclusion laws and the eugenics-driven laws that limited the number of Chinese in this country were finally repealed in 1965. So they became deracialized, and it enabled thousands of people from Hong Kong, Taiwan, increasingly mainland China, but also parts of the diaspora of Chinese and other Asians to begin migrating into this country in a way that had never been allowed before. That gets into a story of yellow peril, of anti-Asian violence, of anti-Asian agitation, and the use of racism and war to keep Asians out of this country. It was seen as a white republic. So we began to realize that it wasn't the merchants or the intellectuals who were the people that were the leaders of the community, which they oftentimes would represent themselves as that. But in fact, it was the thousands of laundry workers, the 10,000 laundry workers who had been managing to eke out a living and survive in the decades during exclusion, and also the restaurant workers who had somehow managed to make a living that really built Chinatown. They were the ones who made bits of pieces of money and then would go to Chinatown on different weekend days and begin to spend the money. And they were the ones who created Chinatown. So in many ways, it was recognizing the Chinese laundry workers' stories and actually having them tell us directly what their stories were about, and are playing a role in sharing them and conveying them through exhibits and oral histories, through radio programs, and other ways of getting the story out, in which all of a sudden, the laundry worker at the corner that maybe a white family had always used and gone to, or a Black family may have had some awareness of and some connection to over generations of that family in that neighborhood, all of a sudden those lives became much more accessible and much more real. So for me, that was far better than taking a course that would never have been taught, because no Chinese laundry stories and histories would have been part of any university curriculum. In fact, we began creating and documenting those stories in a way that now can become part of that curriculum. But part of the question is, are those stories used as part of the storytelling or not? And are people more focused on certain kinds of theories and certain kinds of approaches, which are important, but also not conveying and using those stories in a way that can be very meaningful in terms of bridging the stories across groups. So there's a lot of pitting of groups against each other, in which is how racism works, and how white supremacy works, and how people basically dehumanize the other in a way that they become thought of as part of the problem of this country, or part of the enemy alien or spies somehow, which is how Yellow Peril has worked. But it's also very comparable to anti-Muslim hatred and violence and stereotypes, but also anti-Blackness, anti-Mexicanness. We could just go on in terms of how these things actually work in society that do perpetuate war and notions of the inhuman other that is dangerous for this country. So that's a partial answer.
And now for the next question. What are your thoughts on the tendency for monuments to highlight one member of history versus acknowledging the masses that are generally part of a movement's success?
Yeah, I mean, we're British society was so focused on a certain kind of notion of the individual and the individual's relationship to God. So that's part of why Calvinism and Puritanism and Protestantism in general is so important for us to understand in terms of a basis for the political culture of the country. We tend to think of that as natural and just the way things are, but it's not the way things have always been, nor is it the way most people in the world actually operate. And it's not to say that Chinese people don't think of themselves as being individuals, but the balance between being an individual, let's say within a family, or the kind of general family kind of priorities is skewed in a certain kind of way in which things are tighter and things are thought about more as a group solution, a group solution and a group future. And even the way traditional Chinese families will eat, or families or gatherings of Chinese at a banquet will eat, is around a round table. And they're sharing the dishes in the center of the table. So there's already a group sense. I have my partner is Jewish, and her mother, who's a wonderful person who's passed, but she grew up being Americanized and thinking that individual portions of food is how you go. So she loved fish, and we got a beautiful whole fish one time of a sea bass. And because she loved fish, she decided she would chop into with a spoon, the serving spoon, about a third of that fish and put it on her plate, right? Now, this kind of notion of individualism gets carried out and expressed in all sorts of ways, including basically taking what's supposed to be shared and really putting it on your plate in which you're the only one who can touch it. Now, those kinds of questions of how individuals then become the stand-in for what is all that's great and all that's brilliant is also an expression, of course, of the way in which hierarchy and elitism actually are expressed. So leaders somehow embody the noble values of wealth and success and hard work that are leading the men to battle. So many of the monuments that we have are really about war heroes. And so, for example, to take someone that we revere in this nation from childhood is George Washington. But from the point of view of indigenous peoples, his father, his brother, and George Washington himself were surveyors. So they're the ones who, in the colonial settler period, even though he became the first president of the United States, as a British person, he carried on the practice of surveying lands that basically were going to be occupied and displacing indigenous people. So from an indigenous point of view, in the oral tradition, he and his family were known as town destroyers because of the political arithmetic that he played out as a surveyor. So of course, the monument to him exists in so many parts of this country. Washington Park, Washington Square Park. There's a Washington Park in Newark. His monument and likeness was created in many places in the Northeast, in the Midwest. But our ability to think of him as a more complex person and someone who was both perhaps the father of Anglo-American society and the US Revolution, but also someone who had a really problematic relationship to indigenous peoples, but also someone who was a slave owner as well, right? Can we think about these people in more complex ways and not simply put them on a pedestal, right? You either think of them as somehow pure heroes that cannot be questioned whatsoever and greater than human, and therefore degrading the people that were indigenous and enslaved, and thinking of them as really less than human and less than deserving of their story also being told in relationship to his story. So the stakes of this are actually quite high in terms of how we think of monuments and how do we put them into a context that actually reveals the more complex and nuanced stories that we know are more true. But somehow the monuments and the way they're presented disconnected from the ideological frameworks in which they're operated tend to dominate. So, and part of the problem is that we just start walking past them and we don't even notice them after a while because those stories are kind of dead stories. And I think the worst thing that we can do is monumentalize people and then forget about them and forget about the actual meaning of what they did and how they did it.
Thank you, Allison, for that question. We've got another one coming in. Could you discuss another specific course or initiative at Rutgers that has grown out of the current initiative to learn from Indigenous communities?
While I was at NYU, I started this, but then I brought it with me to Rutgers. I've been working with Munsee Lenape people for now 6 years, which is really just a tiny fraction of time. And they've become really my teachers in terms of unlearning so much of American history that I was taught in graduate school and as an undergraduate, and begin to rethink about how to reperiodize history. So that's part of why I'm really insisting that we think before, right, 1776, before the American Revolution, as if that's a dramatic change. We need to understand how the colonial occupation of the Northeast, of the U.S. Northeast, has its own history, and that before they arrived, or just at the early point of their arrival, we can also begin to tell the story of really the Indigenous folks themselves. So fortunately, the tradition of Indigenous folks across the world is really an oral tradition, which we tend to think of from a kind of a Western analytical, a kind of mechanistic point of view as well. Memories are faulty, so their oral histories cannot be accurate. But in fact, as I've been working with people who tell the stories of generations and including origin stories, it actually reveals certain kinds of details and qualities that are actually quite important for us to take seriously and understand.
So you started with Dr.
These stories are not simply the accuracy of.
I think we're having a little bit of technical difficulty. Yes, can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
I think we didn't catch that last sentence of yours.
I'm not sure I remember what the last sentence was, but you're going to say we started with Dr. King. So did you want to?
Yeah. So you started with Dr. King. Can you comment on the possibilities you see for a Black Asian anti-racist coalition?
Absolutely. I mean, I think, first of all, as I was trying to convey, the work I've done around yellow peril was trying to locate this kind of way, the way in which Chinese first, but also other Asians get lumped into a racial formation. And that racial formation becomes part of the larger discourse of scientific racism and eugenics. And that's all ranked in a hierarchy. And we know certainly from just comparing the way in which anti-Asian violence and anti-Black violence happens, that in some ways there's comparability. But unless we actually get into the deeper local history of how Asians maybe in California, who were in much larger numbers than Blacks in California at the time of Chinese arrival, or Chinese arriving in New York at a time in which the enslaved generations of enslaved people were in New York, that those pecking orders and hierarchies are related. And they're not so much related to each other, although they are if people really did develop those relationships independently, but they're always related through the white power structure and white supremacy. So I think we just need to come up with better understandings of how our histories are intertwined and interrelated. And in many ways, white supremacy and the racism against Indigenous peoples, which kind of gets shunted to the margins, but anti-Black racism, which also emerges at the same time as the land dispossession happens, and then anti-Asian racism, in which Asians become the first groups excluded from the United States, and the immigration laws and the border patrols and the bureaucratic systems of keeping track of people, surveillance systems, were really developed to keep the Asians out, right? So that those are the foundations that are interrelated to creating a sense of what the white republic is all about. So all subsequent immigrants who come in have to kind of fit themselves in relationship to that foundation that's already existed. So Dr. King's comments in many ways underscore the complexity of how racial relationships are formed, oftentimes in moments of war, and how Black soldiers and Blacks who are in the military, who are first segregated and kept out, then being able to enter in and take advantage of some of the benefits of being in the military as a way out of the neighborhoods that are being redlined or disinvested, how those become ways in which they participate in some of the wars in Asia, for example, and how in many ways there's a pitting against people out of that experience, but also there's new awarenesses and new combinations of people that begin to form new kinds of lives. So, for example, we know that many of the most amazing Asian American playwrights are actually coming out of military families in which Black soldiers are intermarrying with either Japanese women during the period of the period of Reconstruction and Japanese American military occupation of Japan, but also of the Korean War. So Valina Hasu Houston, for example, is someone who grew up on a military base after their families returned to the United States. And her ability to write about the experience of what it meant to be Asian and Black are really, I think, for us, the paths that we need to follow to understand the deep histories that are kind of beneath the surface and beneath the patina of somehow Blacks and Asians not being able to get along together. It's just not true. It's not true at all. But if we follow the path of these stories and the real people, we begin to see the histories and contexts in which people are deeply intertwined and interrelated.
Tea is a favorite play of mine, and I would really like to encourage everyone, if you do have a question, please throw it into the comments. Just to sort of add in as another model of Black-Asian solidarity that is very Rhode Island is Grace Lee Boggs. Oh, and as well connected to excavating histories, and specifically Chinatown in Providence. Providence did have a Chinatown, actually it had two, but that Grace Lee Boggs was born in the apartment above her father's Chinese restaurant on Westminster Street in downtown Providence. So we have these models. And so I absolutely agree with you, Jack. And also because I teach a course on Black Asian intersectionalities, that oftentimes these histories are erased, but that time and time again, coalition and solidarity have been part of the long history of Asians in the U.S., of African Americans in the U.S. So there's a little sort of fun fact about Providence for you.
Yeah, and I think the best way is not to go through a white interlocutor, not to say that they're totally incapable of playing a productive coalitional role that supports Black and Asian studies and Black and Asian solidarity. But if it goes through a colonial framework, which is really kind of an expression of the ways in which Blackness and Asianness, yellow peril and anti-Blackness have always been constituted, then it's really a dangerous way to further really kind of a separation and an understanding through the white history, through the Protestant history, for example, in which only people who assimilate into that dominant way of relating to the world can actually do well, right? And that's a real problem when it deals with understanding, let's say, relationships to the soil, relationships to how do you keep the soil alive as opposed to filling it with fertilizers and chemicals that really kill the life of the soil itself. We're now faced with a world in which this country has basically been perpetuating soil that is dead and soil that requires more and more artificial fertilizers and more insecticides that basically further kill the soil and have people depend on companies like the formerly named Monsanto to be able to keep on growing things. So how does even the soil become commodified in a way in which people cannot just simply go and plant something to really grow their own food? So those questions are fundamental now to the future of this country. And those business practices and corporations have really tried to patent all the local practices around the world and basically further extract the thousands of years of practices of growing certain kinds of rices and grains, corns, squashes, that then become further and further privatized and become part of the political arithmetic that is part of the problem that we're still dealing with today.
We've got one last question. How do you think current tensions between the US and China affect the way we tell and commemorate the history of Asian Americans?
Well, the history of the relations between the United States and China itself needs to be understood. And that also is a source of how the Asian American experience is framed. And it's complicated because from any one period of time in which, let's say, Japan is seen as the good Asian country and China is seen as the bad Asian country, or North Korea is seen as the dangerous, crazy Asian country, and then Vietnam after the war is seen as the friendly, country. I mean, you see these relationships with different parts of Asia flip-flopping from enemy to being all good or all bad, which is really just a crazy way in which stereotypes of Asian Americans also operates. Now, the reality in the States is that for the great majority of people who don't actually know any Asian person or Asian culture, there's a great deal of confusion when people look at our faces, and some of them may be darker, some of them may be lighter. There are differences from region to region within Asia, of course, but then there's a general kind of lumping and lack of real understanding of the profound differences that exist and the profound language distinctions and dialects that are spoken. So that kind of lumping and agglomeration is part of the problem, but also the emergence of an Asian American movement has been precisely to kind of grapple with that kind of racism and to try to form an effective political coalition that can actually deal with the changes that need to be made. So we're kind of talking about, on the one hand, this kind of racial formation that is incredibly racist and incredibly manipulative in terms of wartime and seeing different Asian groups as an enemy. They can flip from one group to another, but then also they're manipulated in terms of how Asian Americans are said, well, you can't be like those bad Chinese over there. You have to be the good Chinaman over here. So that kind of playing off of different ways in which wealth and power operate through whiteness is actually part of the danger that we face as well.
Thank you so much, Jack. That is all for that. That is so much for this evening. We really appreciate everything you've offered. Thank you to all our viewers for the questions that you've given us. I'm now going to thank Jack, thank the audience. Thank you to our co-sponsors, the URI College of Arts and Sciences, URI's Department of History, and URI's Chinese flagship program. Our series will resume after the holidays on February 3rd with a talk by James Young. Please visit uri.edu/humanities/events to learn more about this and other upcoming events. Thank you all so much and have a wonderful evening.